The moment you step into the presence of God, everything that once limited you begins to lose its power. Fear starts trembling. Confusion begins to clear. Burdens that felt heavier than mountains suddenly feel lighter than air. The atmosphere shifts, not because your circumstances changed yet, but because you changed position. You move from striving into surrender, from anxiety into authority, from weakness into divine alignment. Breakthrough does not begin in the visible world. It begins in the unseen realm where God's presence reigns. So many people are exhausted, not because they lack faith, but because they keep trying to solve spiritual battles with human strength. They push harder, run faster, pray longer, yet still feel stuck. But breakthrough is not unlocked by effort alone. It is unlocked by encounter. When God's presence invades your life, doors that were sealed by years of struggle open effortlessly. Walls fall without a fight. Chains break without resistance. Healing flows without force. Restoration happens without strain. The presence of God carries a power that no obstacle can withstand. Breakthrough begins in God's presence, not human effort, because the deepest transformations in life never come from how hard we push, but from how deeply we surrender. Many people spend years exhausting themselves trying to fix situations with their own strength, intelligence, connections, and persistence. They pray, work, plan, and struggle, yet still feel stuck, frustrated, and overwhelmed. The issue is not lack of effort. The issue is misplaced dependence. Human effort has limits, but God's presence has no boundaries. When you rely only on what you can do, you eventually reach a wall. But when you step into God's presence, you tap into a power that has no ceiling, no expiration, and no restrictions. In God's presence, you stop carrying burdens that were never meant to rest on your shoulders. Anxiety comes from trying to control outcomes that belong to God. Fear comes from believing you must protect yourself without divine covering. Frustration comes from pushing against doors that God never opened. But when you enter God's presence, your spirit realigns with truth. You remember that God is sovereign, faithful, powerful, and intentional. You are no longer fighting for victory. You are standing in victory. The pressure lifts because you realize you are not alone in the battle. God's presence shifts the weight from your strength to his strength. Human effort often creates burnout, but God's presence releases renewal. When people operate only in their own power, they grow weary, impatient, reactive, and discouraged. Their emotions fluctuate based on circumstances. Their faith rises and falls based on visible outcomes. But in God's presence, strength is renewed from the inside out. Hope is restored. Vision becomes clear. Peace stabilizes the mind. Confidence returns to the heart. You begin to move from a place of spiritual rest instead of emotional exhaustion. You learn that resting in God's presence is not inactivity. It is alignment with divine flow. Breakthrough happens when you shift from striving to surrender. Surrender does not mean giving up responsibility. It means giving God authority. It means trusting his wisdom above your logic, his timing above your urgency, his ways above your preferences. When you surrender in God's presence, your heart becomes teachable, sensitive, and obedient. Pride dissolves. Fear loosens its grip. Control releases its hold. In that atmosphere, God can move freely because resistance has been removed. Breakthrough does not come because you pushed harder. It comes because you yielded deeper. Many people confuse activity with productivity in the spiritual realm. They stay busy with religious routines, but remain disconnected from relational intimacy. They recite prayers, but do not linger in God's presence. They know information about God, but lack transformation from God. Presence changes this dynamic. Presence turns prayer into conversation, worship into encounter, and obedience into joy. When God becomes your source instead of your backup plan, everything shifts. Your decisions become wiser. Your reactions become calmer. Your faith becomes steadier. Your confidence becomes rooted. God's presence also corrects the false belief that you must earn breakthroughs through performance. Grace reminds you that God moves because of his goodness, not your perfection. When you dwell in God's presence, you experience acceptance before achievement, love before labor, and identity before assignment. This removes pressure and comparison. You stop measuring yourself against others and start trusting God's unique plan for your life. Breakthrough flows naturally when you operate from secure identity instead of desperate striving. In God's presence, clarity replaces confusion. Many struggles continue simply because people cannot discern the right direction. They chase every opportunity, react emotionally, and make rushed decisions. But presence sharpens spiritual sensitivity. You begin to hear God's guidance more clearly. You learn when to move and when to wait. You recognize which doors are distractions and which doors carry destiny. This clarity saves years of unnecessary battles, mistakes, and heartbreak. Breakthrough is accelerated when your steps are divinely ordered. God's presence also reshapes your inner world before changing your outer world. He heals wounds, renews thought patterns, restores confidence, and strengthens faith. Without this inner transformation, external breakthroughs often collapse under pressure. But when your foundation is rooted in God's presence, your breakthrough becomes sustainable, not temporary. You don't just receive blessings, you become mature enough to steward them wisely. When you learn to depend on God's presence instead of your own strength, fear loses authority over your decisions. You stop shrinking back from opportunities. You stop settling for less than God's promises. You move forward with courage, not because you feel capable, but because you trust God's faithfulness. Faith becomes active, bold, and obedient. Even when uncertainty remains, peace anchors your heart. God's presence teaches you that waiting is not wasted. Human effort wants instant results, quick answers, and immediate relief. But presence develops patience, endurance, and character. You begin to understand that God is shaping you while preparing your breakthrough. You trust that divine timing protects you from premature success that could damage your destiny. Waiting becomes a season of strengthening, not frustration. Ultimately, breakthrough begins in God's presence because presence transforms who you are before changing what you experience. It aligns your heart with heaven's will, your mind with truth, and your spirit with power. You stop operating from fear, pressure, and control and start walking in faith, peace, and authority. When God becomes your source, your strength, and your foundation, breakthrough is no longer something you chase. It becomes something that flows naturally from a life anchored in his presence. God's presence shifts atmospheres and perspectives because when he enters a space, nothing remains the same. Atmospheres carry spiritual influence. Fear can dominate a room. Faith can fill a home. Peace can settle a heart. Anxiety can suffocate a mind. Every environment carries an invisible climate that shapes thoughts, emotions, decisions, and behavior. When God's presence enters, that climate is transformed. Darkness loses authority. Confusion weakens. Hopelessness fades. Clarity rises. Strength replaces weakness. What once felt heavy becomes lighter, not because circumstances instantly changed, but because the spiritual atmosphere shifted. Many people live under emotional and mental pressure because they remain surrounded by negative atmospheres created by worry, past trauma, disappointment, and fear. These invisible pressures influence how they see themselves and their future. They begin to expect failure instead of favor, loss instead of victory, delay instead of destiny. But when God's presence fills your life, it interrupts those patterns. It introduces divine truth into spaces where lies once ruled. You begin to breathe differently, think differently, and respond differently. The same problem that once felt overwhelming begins to look manageable because God's presence reshapes your inner environment. Perspective determines direction. If you see yourself as powerless, you will live cautiously and reactively. If you see God as distant, you will live anxiously and insecurely. But when you encounter God's presence, your perspective shifts from limitation to possibility, from fear to faith, from pressure to peace. You begin to view challenges through heaven's lens rather than human fear. You realize that obstacles are not proof of abandonment. They are opportunities for divine intervention. God's presence reminds you that nothing in your life is beyond his reach or control. Fear thrives in uncertainty, but God's presence stabilizes the mind. When fear dominates, imagination exaggerates worst-case scenarios, creating emotional paralysis and hesitation. But in God's presence, peace becomes louder than panic. You begin to trust even when answers are incomplete. You learn to rest in God's sovereignty instead of stressing over details you cannot control. This inner stability allows you to make wise decisions instead of emotional reactions. Calm clarity replaces impulsive anxiety. God's presence also cleanses distorted thinking. Many people unknowingly carry false beliefs about themselves, their worth, their future, and even about God Past failures, rejection, and disappointment shape these beliefs. Over time, these mental strongholds limit expectation and confidence. But when God's presence touches the mind, truth replaces lies. You begin to see yourself as loved, chosen, capable, and protected. Your identity stabilizes. Your confidence grows. You stop interpreting life through past pain and start interpreting it through divine promise. Atmosphere affects behavior. A negative atmosphere breeds impatience, anger, discouragement, and doubt. A godly atmosphere cultivates joy, patience, faith, humility, and hope. When God's presence fills your heart, your reactions begin to change. You respond with grace instead of defensiveness. You speak life instead of negativity. You approach challenges with wisdom instead of panic. This transformation is not forced. It flows naturally from inner alignment with God. God's presence also sharpens spiritual vision. You begin to recognize opportunities where others see obstacles. You discern motives instead of assuming intentions. You sense divine direction instead of guessing blindly. This clarity protects you from unnecessary battles, toxic relationships, and unwise decisions. It helps you invest energy in what truly matters rather than wasting it on distractions. Perspective shift also impacts gratitude. When God's presence fills your awareness, you begin to notice blessings instead of only problems. Gratitude grows because you recognize God's activity even in small details. Gratitude softens the heart, increases joy, and strengthens faith. A thankful perspective attracts more peace and spiritual sensitivity. When atmosphere shifts, influence follows. Your home becomes calmer. Your conversations become healthier. Your relationships become stronger. Your workplace becomes more peaceful. People sense stability, kindness, and confidence in you because God's presence radiates through your attitude and behavior. You become a carrier of hope rather than a receiver of stress. God's presence also transforms how you handle pressure. Pressure no longer produces panic, it produces prayer. Instead of collapsing emotionally, you lean into God's nearness. Instead of complaining, you trust. Instead of reacting harshly, you respond with wisdom. Emotional maturity grows naturally when God's presence governs your inner world. Perspective shift protects against comparison. When you live in God's presence, you become secure in your identity and calling. You stop measuring your progress against others. You stop rushing your process. You trust that God's timing and plan for your life is intentional and perfect. This peace prevents jealousy, insecurity, and competition from controlling your heart. God's presence also restores hope. Hope is not wishful thinking. It is confident expectation rooted in God's character. When hope is alive, endurance increases. Faith remains strong. Vision stays clear. Even in seasons of waiting or uncertainty, hope anchors the soul. When your atmosphere changes internally, external breakthroughs begin to align naturally. Decisions improve. Relationships strengthen. Opportunities increase. Favor flows. Wisdom multiplies. Breakthrough becomes sustainable because it flows from a healthy inner foundation. Ultimate. Eli. God's presence shifts atmospheres and perspectives by recentering your life around divine truth instead of human fear. It renews the mind, stabilizes emotions, strengthens faith, and aligns identity. You stop reacting to life and start responding with spiritual authority. You no longer live under pressure, confusion, and anxiety. You live under peace, clarity, and confidence. When God governs your inner atmosphere, your outer world begins to reflect heaven's order, peace, and power. Intimacy with God unlocks power and authority because true spiritual strength is not generated through talent, position, or knowledge, but through relationship. Power in the kingdom of God flows from closeness, not credentials. Authority grows from surrender, not status. When a believer consistently dwells in God's presence, something begins to change internally. Confidence becomes rooted. Faith becomes bold. Discernment becomes sharp, and obedience becomes natural. You stop trying to impress God and start walking with him, and that relationship produces a strength that cannot be manufactured by human effort. Many people desire power without intimacy. They want visible results without invisible devotion. They want authority without alignment. But spiritual power cannot be borrowed or copied. It must be cultivated through consistent connection with God. Just as a branch draws life from the vine, believers draw spiritual vitality from intimacy with God. Without that connection, spiritual dryness, confusion, and weakness slowly creep in. But when intimacy is maintained, spiritual life flows continuously, producing strength, clarity, and stability. Intimacy develops sensitivity. When you spend time in God's presence, your spirit becomes more alert to his voice, guidance, and correction. You begin to recognize subtle promptings instead of needing loud warnings. Obedience becomes quicker because your heart remains soft. This sensitivity protects you from mistakes and positions you for divine opportunities. Authority grows because you move in alignment with heaven rather than personal impulse. Power flows naturally when obedience is rooted in love rather than fear. Many believers struggle with consistency because they obey out of obligation, guilt, or pressure. But intimacy changes motivation. When you genuinely love God and enjoy his presence, obedience becomes a response of affection rather than fear. This type of obedience carries authority because it flows from agreement with God's will, not resistance to it. Heaven supports actions that are aligned with God's heart. Intimacy also strengthens identity. When you know God personally, you understand who you are in him. Your worth no longer depends on achievements, approval, or comparison. You become secure, grounded, and confident. This inner security allows you to stand boldly in spiritual authority without arrogance or insecurity. You no longer seek validation from people because your identity is anchored in God's love. Authority flows best through humility, not ego. Spiritual authority is not about controlling others. It is about governing your own life under God's leadership. When intimacy deepens, discipline strengthens naturally. You become more mindful of what you allow into your mind, heart, and environment. You guard your words, thoughts, and reactions more intentionally. This self-governance releases spiritual authority because your life aligns with divine order. Chaos loses influence where alignment increases. Intimacy also fuels courage. When you walk closely with God, fear weakens because trust strengthens. You become more willing to step into unknown territory because you trust God's guidance and protection. This boldness is not reckless. It is rooted in confidence that God is leading. Courage allows you to take faith-filled actions that unlock new levels of breakthrough and influence. Power without intimacy becomes dangerous. It leads to pride, manipulation, and spiritual burnout. But intimacy keeps power pure. It keeps motives clean. It keeps the heart humble. It keeps the focus on God's glory rather than personal recognition. When intimacy leads, power follows safely and sustainably. Intimacy also sharpens spiritual authority in prayer. Prayer becomes more effective when relationship deepens. You stop praying from desperation and start praying from confidence. You pray with clarity, faith, and alignment. You recognize God's will more clearly, allowing your prayers to carry authority rather than uncertainty. Heaven responds strongly to prayers that flow from relational alignment. When intimacy grows, spiritual discernment increases. You become better at recognizing spiritual influences, deceptive opportunities, unhealthy relationships, and subtle distractions. Discernment protects your calling and preserves your spiritual strength. Authority grows when wisdom guides decisions. Intimacy also strengthens resilience. When trials arise, intimate believers remain stable because their foundation is rooted in relationship rather than circumstances. They are not shaken easily by disappointment, delay, or opposition. Their peace remains steady because their trust is anchored in God's faithfulness. This stability allows them to endure challenges without losing spiritual momentum. Authority is also reflected in influence. People naturally trust those who carry peace, wisdom, humility, and consistency. When intimacy shapes character, influence expands. Your words carry weight. Your presence brings peace. Your counsel brings clarity. Your prayers release hope. Influence becomes a platform for God's power to flow through your life. Intimacy produces spiritual alignment that invites divine favor. Favor opens doors that effort cannot. Favor connects you with the right people, opportunities, and resources. Favor accelerates progress without striving. Favor protects from unnecessary battles. Favor flows where intimacy remains strong. When intimacy becomes your lifestyle, spiritual hunger increases instead of fading. You desire more of God, not less. Growth continues. Sensitivity deepens. Faith matures. This hunger keeps your spiritual life vibrant and effective. Ultimately, intimacy with God unlocks power and authority because it aligns your heart with heaven's will, your mind with truth, and your actions with obedience. You become a vessel God can trust with influence, responsibility, and spiritual impact. Your authority flows not from who you know, what you own, or what you achieve, but from who you walk with daily. When relationship becomes your foundation, power becomes your overflow, and authority becomes your natural expression of a life deeply rooted in God. Breakthrough requires letting go of what limits you because God cannot fill hands that are already full, heal hearts that refuse to open, or elevate lives that cling tightly to what keeps them small. Many people desire change, growth, and blessing, yet unconsciously hold on to fears, habits, mindsets, wounds, and attachments that quietly block progress. God's presence lovingly reveals these limitations, not to condemn, but to free. Until something is released, something new cannot fully enter. Freedom begins where surrender becomes honest. Holding on to fear restricts faith. Fear convinces the mind that safety is found in control, predictability, and avoidance. It whispers that failure is fatal, risk is dangerous, and change is threatening. But fear shrinks vision and limits obedience. When fear governs decisions, destiny remains dormant. God invites you to release fear so faith can rise. Faith expands perspective, strengthens courage, and activates movement. Letting go of fear allows God to lead you into new territory without constant hesitation and retreat. Bitterness is another silent limiter. Unforgiveness anchors the heart to past pain, betrayal, and disappointment. It drains emotional energy and clouds spiritual sensitivity. Bitterness keeps wounds alive long after the event has passed. God's presence brings healing by inviting forgiveness, not because the offense was acceptable, but because your future deserves freedom. Releasing bitterness restores peace, clarity, and emotional strength. Forgiveness unlocks internal breakthrough that often precedes external transformation. Self-reliance can also block divine flow. Depending solely on personal ability, intelligence, or experience may produce temporary success but limits spiritual growth. God desires partnership, not independence. When you trust only your own strength, you unintentionally restrict God's involvement. Surrender invites divine wisdom, provision, protection, and timing. Letting go of control allows God to guide your steps more accurately and powerfully. Old mindsets often restrict new seasons. Limiting beliefs formed through past failures, negative words, cultural conditioning, or trauma shape expectations unconsciously. If you believe you are unworthy, high, incapable, or destined to struggle, your actions will reflect those beliefs. God's presence renews the mind by replacing lies with truth. Letting go of outdated thinking allows your faith to expand and align with God's promises. Transformation accelerates when thinking changes. Pride is another barrier that blocks growth. Pride resists correction, avoids vulnerability, and protects ego. It prevents learning, repentance, and healthy accountability. God opposes pride, not as punishment, but because pride isolates the heart from grace. Humility opens the door to wisdom, growth, and spiritual alignment. Letting go of pride allows God to shape character and expand capacity. Sometimes people hold on to unhealthy relationships, environments, or habits because they feel familiar and comfortable, even if they are damaging. Comfort can become captivity when it prevents growth. God may call you to release relationships that drain faith, habits that weaken discipline, or environments that compromise values. This release can feel painful and uncertain, but obedience creates room for healthier connections and opportunities to emerge. Letting go also applies to unrealistic expectations and timelines. Impatience pressures God's process and creates unnecessary frustration. Trusting God's timing requires surrendering control over outcomes. When you release urgency and comparison, peace increases and faith stabilizes. God's timing protects you from premature blessings that you are not yet prepared to sustain. Guilt and shame are heavy limitations that imprison identity. Past mistakes, failures, or regrets can convince the heart that redemption is impossible. God's grace removes shame and restores dignity. Letting go of guilt allows you to walk forward confidently instead of constantly looking backward. Healing begins when you accept forgiveness fully. Releasing limitations does not mean losing identity. It means discovering your true identity. God removes what distorts your purpose so he can reveal your potential. He prunes not to harm, but to increase fruitfulness. Each release creates space for growth, clarity, peace, and power. Letting go requires trust. It involves stepping into uncertainty with confidence that God is faithful. Faith grows when you choose obedience over comfort. God honors surrender with supernatural alignment. When you release what blocks you, God releases what blesses you. Breakthrough is often delayed not by spiritual opposition, but by internal resistance. God respects free will and waits for willing hearts. He invites cooperation rather than force. When surrender becomes genuine, acceleration begins. Letting go also builds spiritual maturity. You learn to prioritize eternal values over temporary comfort. You become more discerning, disciplined, and emotionally healthy. Freedom increases because attachments weaken. Joy increases because burdens decrease. When you release limitations, your capacity expands. You become ready for either responsibility, influence, and blessing. God entrusts more to those who steward freedom wisely. Ultimately, letting go is not about loss. It is about exchange. You exchange fear for faith, bitterness for peace, control for trust, pride for humility, shame for confidence, and limitation for destiny. God never removes something without replacing it with something better. When your hands are open, heaven can fill them. When your heart is surrendered, God can shape it. When your spirit is willing, breakthrough flows naturally. True breakthrough begins when you stop clinging to what restricts you and start embracing what God desires to build within you. God's presence produces courage to obey even when fear exists, because obedience is not driven by comfort, certainty, or emotional readiness, but by trust in God's faithfulness. Fear is a natural human response to uncertainty, risk, and change. It warns, questions, and hesitates. But fear does not disappear simply because faith exists. Often, fear and faith coexist in the same moment. The difference lies in which voice you choose to follow. God's presence strengthens faith so that obedience becomes stronger than fear. Many people wait until fear disappears before they act, but that moment rarely comes. If obedience depended on perfect confidence, most breakthroughs would never happen. God invites his people to move forward even when their hearts tremble, trusting that his presence will sustain them through the unknown. Courage is not the absence of fear. It is the decision to trust God despite fear. In God's presence, you receive assurance that you are not stepping alone, and that confidence fuels action. Fear often exaggerates consequences and minimizes God's ability. It focuses on what could go wrong rather than what God can do. But when you dwell in God's presence, your focus shifts. You begin to remember God's past faithfulness, his promises, and his character. This remembrance strengthens inner resolve. Faith rises when you recognize that God's power exceeds your limitations. Obedience becomes an act of worship rather than a risk calculation. God's presence also stabilizes emotions, so fear does not control decision-making. When fear governs choices, people often avoid growth, delay obedience, and settle for safety instead of purpose. They remain stuck in familiar patterns because comfort feels predictable. But God's presence reminds the heart that spiritual growth requires movement. Staying stagnant may feel safe, but it slowly weakens faith and limits potential. Obedience stretches faith, develops maturity, and unlocks new levels of spiritual authority. When God's presence strengthens courage, you begin to act with wisdom instead of impulse. Courage is not reckless behavior. It is obedient alignment with divine direction. You move forward not because emotions are calm, but because your spirit is anchored in trust. God's presence provides inner peace even when external circumstances remain uncertain. That peace acts as confirmation that you are walking in alignment with God's will. Fear often attacks identity, whispering that you are not capable, prepared, or worthy. But God's presence reinforces identity. You remember who you are in Christ and whose authority you operate under. Identity confidence weakens fear's influence. You stop questioning your value and begin trusting God's assignment for your life. Obedience flows more naturally when identity is secure. God's presence also develops spiritual resilience. Each step of obedience strengthens confidence for the next step. Faith grows through experience. When you witness God's faithfulness after stepping forward in fear, trust deepens. Over time, fear loses its dominance because evidence of God's reliability accumulates. Obedience becomes easier as spiritual muscles strengthen. Courageous obedience often unlocks divine acceleration. God honors faith-filled steps with guidance, provision, protection, and favor. When you obey despite fear, you position yourself for supernatural alignment. Doors open that human effort cannot force. Opportunities emerge that logic could not predict. Relationships align that support destiny. Breakthrough often follows obedience that required courage. God's presence also teaches discernment between healthy caution and limiting fear. Not every hesitation is wisdom. Sometimes hesitation is fear disguised as logic. In God's presence, you gain clarity to distinguish between genuine warning and self-protection rooted in insecurity. Discernment prevents missed opportunities and unnecessary retreat. Fear thrives in isolation, but courage grows in communion with God. When you remain close to God, you receive constant reassurance, correction, and guidance. Intimacy keeps your heart anchored so fear does not spiral into anxiety or paralysis. God's presence reminds you that obedience is safer than disobedience, even when it feels uncomfortable. Courageous obedience reshapes character. It builds humility, patience, endurance, and trust. Each act of obedience strengthens spiritual maturity. Over time, you become more confident in following God's voice quickly and faithfully. Delay decreases, sensitivity increases, faith becomes active and consistent. God's presence also helps you release the fear of failure and rejection. Many people avoid obedience because they fear making mistakes or being judged by others. But when God's presence governs your heart, pleasing God becomes more important than pleasing people. You learn to value obedience over approval. This freedom empowers bold decisions aligned with divine purpose rather than public opinion. Fear may still whisper, but it no longer controls direction. Faith becomes louder than anxiety. Peace becomes stronger than pressure. Confidence becomes rooted in God's character rather than personal ability. Obedience becomes a natural expression of trust. Ultimately, God's presence produces courage because it reminds you that you are never alone in your obedience. He walks with you into uncertainty. He strengthens you when weakness arises. He guides you when clarity feels limited. He protects you when vulnerability feels risky. His presence transforms fear from a barrier into a stepping stone for growth. When you choose obedience in the presence of fear, you experience spiritual expansion. Faith deepens, confidence grows, authority increases, breakthrough aligns. Courage becomes your lifestyle rather than your struggle. Obedience becomes joyful rather than fearful. Trust becomes your foundation rather than uncertainty. God's presence empowers you to move forward boldly even when fear still exists. God's presence builds peace, patience, and spiritual maturity because it transforms the way the believer experiences life's challenges and waiting periods. Many people approach breakthrough with urgency, wanting immediate results and visible signs of progress. They pray, plan, and strive, but when answers are delayed, anxiety rises, frustration grows, and faith weakens. The absence of God's presence turns waiting into suffering, delay into despair, and testing into temptation. But when God's presence fills a heart, waiting is no longer wasted. Challenges become opportunities for growth, and the soul experiences stability in the midst of uncertainty. Peace emerges naturally in God's presence because his presence carries order, clarity, and divine perspective. Life can feel chaotic, but when God's presence rests upon you, confusion and fear begin to dissipate. Decisions become clearer, emotions become steadier, and reactions are no longer dictated by circumstances. Peace is not simply the absence of trouble. It is the assurance of God's control despite trouble. It stabilizes the heart and mind, enabling believers to navigate challenges with faith instead of fear, patience instead of impatience, and wisdom instead of anxiety. Patience develops in God's presence because you learn to trust God's timing rather than forcing outcomes according to your own schedule. Impatience often leads to hasty decisions, mistakes, and spiritual vulnerability. Human effort seeks immediate gratification, but God's process is intentional and protective. Waiting in his presence trains the spirit to endure, strengthens character, and increases faith. It allows the believer to understand that delay is not denial and that preparation often precedes promotion. Patience cultivated in presence prevents burnout and preserves energy for the assignments God is positioning you to receive. Spiritual maturity grows when the believer consistently dwells in God's presence because it transforms internal character rather than merely external circumstances. Many people measure spiritual growth by what they receive or accomplish, but true maturity is seen in how a person responds under pressure, uncertainty, and delay. When God's presence permeates the heart, emotions are refined, attitudes are aligned with his will, and decisions reflect wisdom rather than impulse. This maturity produces stability, enabling the believer to sustain breakthroughs and responsibilities without being overwhelmed by them. God's presence teaches endurance because it demonstrates that life is not always about instant solutions, but about developing inner resilience. Many challenges are designed not to defeat you, but to strengthen faith and deepen reliance on God. When his presence becomes your constant companion, endurance becomes natural. You no longer collapse under pressure or abandon faith when circumstances resist change. Instead, you remain anchored in the reality that God is orchestrating everything for your ultimate good, and this perspective allows you to wait, persevere, and grow in strength. Peace in God's presence also protects the mind from anxiety and distraction. Anxiety clouds judgment, weakens faith, and invites spiritual attack. When God's presence fills your thoughts and heart, it displaces worry with trust, fear with confidence, and confusion with clarity. A peaceful heart can hear divine guidance more accurately, make better decisions, and avoid unnecessary conflict. Peace stabilizes relationships, interactions, and choices, creating an environment where breakthrough can naturally manifest. Patience allows for alignment with divine timing, which is crucial for sustaining long-term success. Human impatience often leads to premature action, missed opportunities, or dependence on the wrong strategies. But God's presence strengthens patience by reminding the heart that timing matters. The seeds of breakthrough may be planted unseen for a season, and the growth may take time to emerge. Patience ensures that when the breakthrough arrives, it is sustainable, mature, and fully aligned with God's purpose. Acting too early can compromise results, but waiting in God's presence preserves integrity and maximizes potential. Spiritual maturity gained through God's presence also produces discernment. A mature believer can distinguish between distractions, tests, and genuine opportunities. They understand which battles to fight and which to leave in God's hands. Maturity allows the heart to remain focused on eternal objectives rather than temporary frustrations. This discernment ensures that energy, time, and faith are invested wisely, producing consistent growth and sustainable breakthrough. God's presence fosters gratitude even in delay. When waiting feels long or progress seems slow, peace reminds the heart to recognize God's faithfulness in the process. Gratitude reduces frustration, strengthens hope, and deepens trust. A patient and grateful heart experiences more joy in the journey and remains receptive to God's guidance rather than resisting it out of anxiety or doubt. Moreover, the combination of peace, patience, and spiritual maturity produces stability that attracts favor and divine alignment. People and circumstances respond to steady, mature energy. Favor flows toward those who exhibit calm confidence rather than frantic striving. Relationships thrive under the influence of a patient, peaceful spirit. Opportunities align for those who wait with faith rather than push recklessly. God's presence becomes both the foundation and the catalyst for sustained breakthrough. Ultimately, God's presence shapes the believer internally before it manifests externally. It builds a foundation that no storm can easily shake, a mindset that no delay can undermine, and a character that no opposition can corrupt. Peace protects, patience strengthens, and spiritual maturity sustains. The breakthroughs that follow are not fleeting. They are enduring and impactful because they are rooted in hearts that have been refined in God's presence. True spiritual strength, lasting victory, and meaningful progress flow from a life anchored in the peace, patience, and maturity that God imparts through his presence. When these qualities dominate the heart, breakthroughs are not only unlocked, but are carried forward with stability, wisdom, and power. Carrying God's presence transforms your environment because his presence is not confined to the inner life of a believer. It radiates outward and influences everything around you. The spiritual atmosphere of a person, home, workplace, or community is not determined solely by external circumstances, but by the life, mindset, and spirit of those within it. When a believer walks in the presence of God, the unseen realm begins to respond. Tension eases, conflict diminishes, clarity rises, and favor increases. The impact is not just personal, it shapes relationships, interactions, and opportunities. Your environment begins to reflect the order, peace, and authority of heaven because God's presence cannot be contained. It flows naturally wherever it is welcome. Many people fail to realize that their surroundings are often a mirror of their inner life. A restless heart breeds restless spaces. Anxiety, fear, bitterness, and negativity subtly affect conversations, decisions, and the energy of the environment. Even without speaking, the spiritual atmosphere communicates itself to others, influencing moods, attitudes, and actions. But when God's presence dwells within you, it produces a natural authority that brings stability. People notice a sense of calm, peace, and confidence that cannot be manufactured. Environments shift because the unseen influence of God's presence begins to dominate the space. Your presence affects people before your words ever reach them. A believer anchored in God's presence radiates hope, peace, and assurance. Relationships respond differently because others sense alignment with God's order. Conversations become more constructive, conflicts are diffused, and cooperation increases. Favor seems to follow naturally because the authority of God's presence draws resources, guidance, and connections that support destiny. Environments transform, not throw. Effort, but through spiritual influence, which is far more powerful and lasting than human manipulation. Carrying God's presence also changes how you experience challenges in your environment. Difficult coworkers, stressful circumstances, or chaotic situations no longer dictate your emotional state. Presence brings perspective. You begin to act with wisdom rather than react in fear. You respond with patience instead of frustration. You carry peace where there was previously tension and clarity where there was confusion. This transformation is not superficial. It reshapes the spiritual dynamic of your surroundings because God's presence carries power and authority that cannot coexist with disorder. Even physical spaces respond to spiritual influence. Homes can feel tense or calm. Workplaces can feel chaotic or organized. Family gatherings can feel heavy or joyful. The difference often depends on the spiritual alignment of those who inhabit those spaces. When a believer walks in God's presence, they become carriers of heaven's energy, releasing peace, favor, and clarity wherever they go. This presence creates conditions where breakthrough becomes possible, not by changing circumstances instantly, but by influencing the environment in ways that allow God's will to operate freely. Carrying God's presence also impacts decision-making within your environment. When the atmosphere is influenced by fear, haste, or frustration, decisions are often reactive and short-sighted. But when presence dominates, choices are made with calmness, wisdom, and discernment. The clarity produced by God's presence allows you to recognize opportunities, avoid unnecessary conflict, and align your actions with divine purpose. People notice the difference and often gravitate toward your leadership, counsel, and influence, even unconsciously, because your environment begins to reflect divine order. Spiritual authority also grows when you consistently carry God's presence. Authority is not about control over others, but dominion over influence and alignment with God's will. As your inner life becomes saturated with his presence, your influence expands naturally. You become a stabilizing force in chaotic situations. Your peace and confidence inspire others to follow, and your discernment directs groups, teams, and families toward productive outcomes. Environments that were once unpredictable and volatile begin to function in a more harmonious, ordered, and fruitful way because God's presence works through you. Carrying God's presence also fosters an atmosphere of faith and expectation. People tend to mirror the spiritual energy around them. When you operate in constant communion with God, your faith becomes infectious. Others sense hope, confidence, and divine possibility. Conversations shift from doubt to expectation. Decisions shift from fear to faith, and outcomes shift from limitation to expansion. This influence does not require you to preach or instruct. Your presence alone communicates stability, assurance, and alignment with heaven. Furthermore, carrying God's presence transforms how you respond to negativity or opposition in your environment. When tension arises, instead of reacting with defensiveness or anxiety, you maintain calm and spiritual authority. Presence allows you to absorb pressure without being influenced by it, redirecting the energy of the environment toward peace and resolution. This ability creates a protective spiritual effect, ensuring that God's favor and purpose are not hindered by external challenges. Ultimately, carrying God's presence is not just about personal benefit. It affects everyone and everything around you. Homes, workplaces, communities, and relationships respond to the spiritual energy you carry. The presence of God creates an atmosphere where peace, clarity, favor, and breakthrough can flourish. You become a conduit through which heaven's influence touches earth, stabilizing chaos, shaping decisions, and releasing divine alignment. When God's presence dwells in you, your environment becomes a reflection of his order, power, and grace, and your influence extends far beyond yourself, producing lasting impact in every area of life. Consistent dwelling in God's presence sustains long-term breakthrough, because breakthrough is not a one-time event. It is a lifestyle shaped by ongoing intimacy with God. Many people experience fleeting moments of success, victory, or divine intervention, only to find themselves back in struggle because they fail to remain rooted in the source of their strength. Temporary breakthroughs without sustained presence often fade because the foundation has not been reinforced. God's presence is the stabilizing force that ensures victories are not just momentary but lasting, creating continuity between effort, faith, and divine intervention. Consistency in God's presence develops spiritual depth. Breakthrough requires more than excitement or momentary inspiration. It requires character, maturity, and alignment. When you dwell regularly in God's presence, your heart is constantly tuned to his voice. Your spirit becomes sensitive to his guidance, and your decisions increasingly reflect his wisdom. This depth transforms your approach to challenges. You stop reacting impulsively and start responding intentionally. Problems no longer shake your foundation because your breakthrough is sustained by the ongoing reality of God's nearness, not by external circumstances or fleeting motivation. Attained breakthrough also flows from the habits formed in consistent presence. Daily communion with God through prayer, worship, meditation on Scripture, and reflection anchors the believer in truth and strengthens faith muscles. Just as physical strength develops through repeated exercise, spiritual strength grows through repeated connection with God. When presence becomes consistent, faith strengthens, vision sharpens, and spiritual authority increases. Each day of consistent connection produces incremental growth that compounds over time, establishing a foundation for lasting breakthroughs rather than temporary victories. Consistency in presence also nurtures resilience. Life inevitably brings trials, setbacks, and opposition. Without a steady connection to God, these challenges can derail progress and undermine confidence. But when you maintain regular access to God's presence, resilience is built into your spiritual DNA. You learn to rely on his strength instead of your own, to see obstacles as temporary rather than permanent, and to trust that God's purposes are unfolding even when outcomes are delayed. This endurance ensures that breakthroughs are not undone by adversity, but are strengthened through it. Another dimension of sustaining breakthrough through consistent presence is the cultivation of alignment. Breakthrough is most effective when your life, heart, and decisions are in sync with God's will. Consistent dwelling in his presence keeps your mind, emotions, and actions aligned with divine purpose. Misalignment often causes breakthroughs to stall, delay, or fail to produce long-term fruit. When your heart remains tuned to God daily, your steps follow his direction naturally. Each breakthrough then becomes not just a moment of success, but a step in a larger, divinely orchestrated journey toward purpose. Consistency also strengthens faith. Faith is not built in a moment of crisis alone. It is developed over time through repeated encounters with God. Every time you spend time in his presence, you are reminded of his faithfulness, goodness, and power. These reminders reinforce trust, allowing you to act boldly even when circumstances appear unfavorable. Long-term breakthroughs require sustained faith because obstacles will continue to emerge. Consistent presence ensures that faith remains active, mature, and able to carry you through challenges without faltering. Sustained presence also enhances spiritual discernment. Breakthrough often comes with choices, opportunities, and responsibilities that require wisdom. Inconsistent connection with God can leave you vulnerable to distraction, misjudgment, or deception. Regular dwelling in his presence sharpens your spiritual senses, enabling you to recognize divine opportunities, avoid pitfalls, and respond appropriately to both encouragement and opposition. Discernment allows breakthrough to continue to grow rather than plateau or regress due to unwise decisions. Furthermore, consistent sense produces intimacy that protects the breakthrough you receive. Breakthroughs can be undermined by pride, selfishness, impatience, or neglect if the heart is not grounded in God. Remaining daily in his presence cultivates humility, gratitude, and awareness of dependence on him. This intimacy ensures that the breakthrough you experience is stewarded wisely, producing lasting fruit rather than fleeting gratification. Your victories remain anchored in God's favor, not in personal effort alone. Finally, consistent dwelling in God's presence creates a life of ongoing influence. Breakthrough is not only personal, it affects families, communities, and spheres of impact. When your breakthrough is sustained by intimacy with God, your presence continues to radiate peace, wisdom, and authority to those around you. Others are encouraged, inspired, and impacted by the stability and faithfulness they see in your life. Sustained breakthrough does not isolate you. It amplifies God's work through your life as a channel of ongoing blessing. Ultimately, consistent dwelling in God's presence sustains long-term breakthrough because it establishes a foundation that cannot be shaken by circumstances. It develops character, resilience, faith, discernment, alignment, humility, and influence. It turns temporary victories into enduring transformations and fleeting successes into lifelong fruitfulness. Presence becomes a lifestyle rather than a momentary experience, ensuring that every breakthrough is anchored in God's reality rather than human effort. When consistency governs your spiritual life, breakthroughs are no longer seasonal. They become natural, continuous expressions of a life fully immersed in God's presence.